Thank you, Minister Fenech, for that speech. Clearly, the idea to set up a think tank, which will be composed of members from the industry and government, will surely be conducive to ensure that we remain focused on the success factors that are the success factors contributing to the growth of this industry. What I'd like to do over the next 15 minutes is take you through the 3 points on the following agenda. Well, in the first part, just a quick overview of the performance of the industry over 2011. It was undoubtedly a challenging year, and I'll give some context, international context to this. Whilst in the second part, I'll just take you through the key initiatives that have been organized by FinanceMalta last year, and particularly the initiatives that we have launched over the course of this year, and conclude this brief address by highlighting my views on the way for the industry going forward. Well, clearly the European markets have been going through very, very difficult and challenging times. The Greek drama of late, the Greek drachma, has been brought into play, interestingly enough. It will be interesting to see how this will pan out in the coming weeks. The Spanish takeover of Bankia as well, the Spanish government's takeover of Bankia. So we're seeing a degree of nationalization of some banks. So definitely it has not been an easy time for the European markets. And particularly if we look at the economic headline numbers, economy shrank from 1.9% in 2010 to 1.4% in 2011. And clearly the outlook for 2012 is not rosy at all. And clearly we've seen, as I highlighted, the intensification of the debt crisis, the tightening of financial conditions, particularly with the introduction of austere measures, as well as fiscal consolidation. On the other hand, if we look at the Maltese economy, clearly the spillovers from the euro crisis have had an effect on the Maltese economy, on the manufacturing side and on the tourism side in particular. But if one looks at the performance of the financial services industry, we've seen this continuing with its growth traction, particularly in its two core sectors, that is insurance and the funds industry. If I narrow my focus to the respective sectors, commencing with the fund sector, we're seeing clearly the continuation of the development of a cluster. So we've seen increasingly service providers, particularly international service providers, setting up their operation in Malta. Just to look at the investment services licenses, which have grown to 109 as at the end of December of last year, which means a 7% year-on-year growth, of which some 80 are Category 2 investment services operators, predominantly those servicing the fund industry. Likewise, on the fund administration side, clearly there is a cluster. I distinctly remember in 1995 we had just one fund management administration company. Today we have 24 fund administrators, and clearly the international operators have overtaken the indigenous operators, which is healthy. It has intensified competition, undoubtedly, but clearly today we have 24, what I showed up as ambassadors, promoting Malta as a domicile for international funds. We've continued to see very healthy growth in terms of new fund licenses. We had 179 new licenses being authorized last year by the Financial Services Authority in Malta. We've had some funds that closed down, but clearly, as you can see on the slide on the right-hand side, we've seen very strong growth in the hedge fund sector, which is leading the growth of the funds industry in Malta. We're likewise seeing interest in the UCITS side. We're seeing gradual interest in fund managers setting up UCITS platforms in Malta, which I think is encouraging, particularly with the developments that UCITS 4 brought about, which means that you do not need to have a UCITS management company in Malta to set up a UCITS fund, and that I think has led to some promoters to consider Malta as a domicile. And likewise, despite the contraction in NAVs, in the net asset values, due to the performance of the markets last year, we've registered a healthy 5% increase because the new business has in a way cushioned the downside by way of the movement in the capital markets. I think what's even interesting is an analysis of the breadth of products that are being registered in Malta in terms of the categories they fall under. And you can see that there are 4 core categories under which the funds licensed fall under. But particularly the range of structures that are being set up in Malta, from retail funds to multi-manager funds, fund of hedge funds, fund of funds, and private equity funds, and likewise the range of investment strategies. So clearly there is a good breadth of products that are being authorized in Malta and in turn are being serviced by Malta-based operators. And I think this slide is truly interesting because one of the benefits of setting up funds in Malta is the fact that you do not need to appoint local service providers, particularly on the administration and on the management side in the case of hedge funds. And this is a conscious policy that the MFSA took when they introduced the PIF regime, and I think it has been really the driver of allowing flexibility to fund managers to set up funds in Malta. Despite this flexibility, it is comforting to note that some 77% of funds that are authorized in Malta are serviced in Malta. And that clearly is an attestation of the quality of service that is being provided by the local fund administration companies in Malta and the cost competitiveness in this respect. The insurance sector clearly growing. It has grown 6.5 times the number of operators we had in 2004, 52 insurance operators. And as you can see, we have diversity as well in the sector, with 35 non-life, life companies, composite and reinsurance companies on the market. What I think is interesting in this respect is that if we look at the figures, and unfortunately the 2011 figures are not yet out, but if you look at the 2010 figures, we're seeing growth in the total gross premiums written. But what's particularly interesting is the pie chart on your right-hand side, because this clearly shows that this sector is truly becoming international, because obviously it is insuring risks not just based in Malta, but based outside of Malta. So clearly one is exploiting the ability to passport services from Malta into mainland Europe. The banking side, as the Minister mentioned, has remained stable. We have 25 banks on the market. The Malta Bankers Association issued a summary just over the last few days on the banking sector, which shows that the assets of the banking sector in Malta has increased to 50 billion, a healthy increase considering the contraction we've seen in the balance sheets of main international banks outside of Malta. And here again, this sector is not just made up of indigenous operators. So we're seeing international banks that have set up their operation in Malta and conducting business cross-border into Europe. And this international dimension is reflected in a way in the shareholding of these banks. And if you look to your left, you will see that the shareholding location of the banks is quite international. Last but not least, the trust sector. We continue to see stable growth in this regard. 121 authorized entities in terms of the Trusts and Trustees Act, made up of trustees, fiduciary service providers, and administrators of private foundations. What I think is even interesting in this respect, and particularly on the pension side, we're seeing interest on the QROP side. And if you look at the numbers compared to 2010, we've had the retirement schemes doubling in number from just 6 in 2010 to 13 in 2011. And likewise, today we have 7 scheme administrators and 3 asset managers that have set up their operation in Malta to provide services to QROPs. Of course, beyond what we promote and what we say during these conferences and what we say through our website and print material, I think international attestations are critically important. And if we look at the World Economic Forum report for 2011/12, Malta still ranks very highly. We have the 12th soundest banking sector in the world when compared with 142 countries on which this comparative has been made. Our internet and information technology capabilities are reflected in the fact that in terms of e-government, we rank first out of the countries that have been surveyed from the World Economic Forum. We are also efficient in the timely transposition of directives, and this is very important because it gives the first mover advantage. The more efficient we are in transposing legislation and transposing directives into our national legislation, this will give the first mover advantage to operators. So clearly this efficiency is important to be maintained and retained. And lastly, equally important, particularly for companies, that are considering to set up their operation in Malta is the quality of life. And here again, we have relatively quite a good ranking. Clearly, the climate outside is testament to that, amongst other matters.